My name is Sue McKenna, and I'm going to be chatting to you for the next few minutes about supervision styles. You may have noticed that in the literature about postgraduate education, the words roles, models, approaches, and styles are used differently in different texts and are often used interchangeably in rather confusing ways. For the purposes of this course, we are going to understand roles to be the various tasks that a supervisor must accomplish. For example, in your institution, one of the roles might be that you have to sit on the higher degrees committee and look through proposals from various students. Or you might need to appoint the examiners for your students. Or you might need to give feedback on your students' writing. For this course, we will understand the terms styles or approaches to mean the ways in which a supervisor interacts with a student. In other words, your manner, your way of being with your students. In other words, this focuses on the supervision relation with particular emphasis on power relations. And in this course, we will understand models to be the particular structure being used for the supervision. For example, whether it's one-on-one supervision, co-supervision, project-based supervision, or so on. And of course, each of these will affect each other. In this particular PowerPoint, I'm going to be focusing on styles and approaches and raising a few issues you might like to consider when you reflect on your own approach to supervision. One of the things that we have emphasized throughout this course is the idea that there are different kinds of supervisor who undertake different kinds of supervision. We have pushed back against the notion of generic best practice, where you can simply learn 10 tips that you can apply to become the perfect supervisor. Postgraduate education is far more complex than that, and we need to be reflexive and flexible in our understanding of our own practices. For example, how does the disciplinary pedagogy affect how you supervise? The nature of the knowledge in your discipline will have an effect on the research that you do and the way in which supervision happens in your field. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Institutional processes will also have an enormous effect on how you supervise. The ethos or culture of your institution is going to have an impact. If you work in an institution that expects you to write letters of warning to students for slow progress, that is going to affect how you relate to your students. If you work in an institution where students are expected to publish as they do their studies, and you are judged if your students do not achieve in this regard, that's going to have an effect on how you interact with your students. And then, of course, there are departmental practices. If you're in a department where everyone does research and supervises, there are going to be far more spaces to have conversations and get support when you hit a supervision challenge. If you're the only one in your department with a doctorate who is supervising, you may find that you have a very different experience. And then, of course, if you're a supervisor or a co-supervisor, or indeed one of a team of supervisors, this is going to affect how you interact with the student. And there is a separate PowerPoint on the issue of models of supervision. Then, of course, there are funders' requirements. Often funders require very clear success in terms of throughput and publication and so on, and this can put pressure on supervisors and students. Are your students full-time or part-time? Do you spend time with them in the staff room on an everyday basis, chatting about their work? Or do you have to schedule time to meet with them because they are only studying part-time? Are they on campus with opportunities to bump into each other? Or are you supervising from a distance using Zoom? These are all going to affect the kind of supervisor you can be. Are you supervising at honours, master's or PhD level? There's a separate PowerPoint that looks at the national regulations in terms of each of these levels. And of course, that will have an effect on your expectations as a supervisor and how you supervise. We would like the participants in this course to reflect deeply on their own context and to consider how that context can constrain and enable their own practices. There are many different models that explain the different approaches to postgraduate supervision. For example, Wisker suggests there's a continuum with, on the one side, supervisors who emphasize technique, who are very much focused on the final product and on ensuring that students attain competence in each step along the way. On the other extreme will be supervisors who focus on negotiating, how they'll work together, and who focus on the process of knowledge production. And of course, there's hundreds of points in between those two extremes. I said I would talk more about the way in which your discipline will affect your supervision, and I'm going to discuss that for a few minutes now. There are a number of typologies available of disciplines that help us to map out the various disciplines that are offered in our universities. I'm going to talk briefly about the one offered by Biglin in 1973. But you can also see Kolb, 1981, and recently I found very useful the work of legitimation code theory as a manner of providing fairly nuanced mapping of different disciplines. One of the biggest critiques of tables such as the one you see before you now is that they are too simplistic, and they suggest that disciplines can feel neatly into categories that are entirely separate from each other. So I think it's important to note that this is just a heuristic to help us have some sense of how disciplines different and how to have a sense of how disciplines are differentiated and not an actual rule of how discretely they actually work. Let me begin by talking about Biglin's model. And Biglin suggests that there are roughly 4 big types of disciplines: the hard pure, soft pure, hard applied, and soft applied. So what does he mean by these terms? Let's first look at the difference between hard and soft. So we've got the hard pure and the hard applied. Biglin suggests that in hard disciplines, there's general agreement on what constitutes a problem in the field, and there's more or less agreement on how one should go about researching that particular problem. Higher degrees committees, for example, will be able to look at a proposal and immediately identify whether the problem the student says they want to research does indeed fit within the discipline. And they will probably more or less agree on the steps that the student should follow in order to undertake that research. Soft fields, on the other hand, have many different problems, and they don't have clear boundaries around what counts as a problem in the field. And the same is true of the methodologies they use. For that reason, a higher degrees committee in a soft field may find themselves arguing about the problem that the students identified and arguing about whether it's a suitable problem for their particular department, their particular discipline. And then they may argue about whether the methodology is appropriate. Even the methods are not going to be easily agreed upon. Should it be a focus group? Should it be a survey? Should it be one-on-one interviews? There'll be a range of methodologies with arguments for and against each, and no final word on which is appropriate. And then, of course, we've got the second part of Biglin's differentiation, which is about whether fields are pure or applied. In terms of pure, we're talking about fields that are quite abstract. They are, to some extent, not directly related to the application of knowledge in the real world. they'll be dealing more with abstracted ideas that sit above the messiness of the real world. So, for example, you can think of physics. In physics, you will kind of develop formulas that are not necessarily immediately related to the application of those physics formulas in the real world. Similarly, in pure mathematics, although the mathematical formulas may have a number of real-world applications, that is not the concern of the discipline. The concern of the discipline is in that abstract mathematics. The applied fields, on the other hand, are very immediately focused on the practical, real-world application of knowledge. And so using this distinction between hard and soft and pure and applied, we end up with 4 large groupings of disciplines or fields. We get the natural sciences like physics, chemistry, mathematics, geology. We get the humanities such as philosophy, English literature. Then we get the hard applied, which would be your science-based professions, such as architecture and engineering. And then we get the soft applied, which would be your social professions, such as teaching or law, or many of the fields in commerce, social work, and so on. Muller suggests that if we look at the differences in types of knowledge in the discipline, we can start to see that the actual cultural style of people in those disciplines would be quite different too. Again, I remind you of the critique that these kinds of heuristics make it seem as if you have 4 completely distinct categories of knowledge, whereas many theorists, such as the legitimation code theorists, would argue that the reality is far messier. Nonetheless, it is somewhat interesting to consider this in a very general heuristic manner. And this particular slide shows the suggestion that those of you that are in the hard pure fields, it's much more competitive, but it's also much more gregarious. And that is because you have much more agreement around the methods and so on. Hard applied, it's much more entrepreneurial, focused out there. It's cosmopolitan, role orientated. A lot of the focus will be on patents rather than publications, whereas the hard pure has very high publication rate in the natural sciences. If we go to the soft pure, the humanities types of fields, then apparently our culture is more individualistic, very loosely organized, focused much more on people rather than on the science, a lower publication rate, and funding's less important because there isn't the need for very expensive equipment. And then if we go to the soft applied, supposedly the cultural style is that there's a bit of anxiety around status. There's a prey to intellectual fashion. So they're fads, they're theories that come and go. There's a lot of power plays, there's a low publication rate, and very vulnerable to funding pressures, vulnerable to cuts during times of austerity. Muller goes further to suggest that there's also a difference in terms of the cognitive styles, in other words, the ways in which knowledge is made. With the hard pures being very cumulative, you need to have the basic foundations in order to go upwards, but it's iterative, so the higher levels speak back to the lower levels. The hard applieds, it's much more pragmatic, and there's a focus on products and techniques. The soft pure, it's holistic, focus on understanding and interpretation, and the soft applied is much more functional, utilitarian, focus on the real world. So, of course, you need to answer the question for yourself. Do you actually have a discipline? Does your research fit neatly into a discipline? And did those earlier slides give you some sense of, did it echo for you? Does your discipline work out in those kinds of ways? And think for a moment, what effect might that have on the way in which supervision happens? But of course, not all of us have disciplines. Many of us may have studied in disciplines in our own formal qualifications, but since then we're now doing far more interdisciplinary studies. We're now working in teams across disciplines and drawing on knowledge from fields that are not our own. And then some of you, especially those of you who are working in universities of technology, may find that your focus is more on a vocation rather than a discipline. So typically, universities of technologies fall into what Muller calls the newer regions. And regions is a term used by Bernstein, which suggests that you don't just have one discrete discipline, such as physics or philosophy, but rather you're working in a field that takes bits and pieces from various disciplines. For example, in dental technology, students need to have a little bit of fine art, they need to have a little bit of engineering, they certainly need to have a chunk of anatomy, but they don't study those subjects. Instead, the curriculum pulls little bits from each of those subjects and many more to present students with induction into becoming a dental technologist and with opportunities to learn all the knowledge, skills, and practices associated with dental technology. A region doesn't only pull from many disciplines. The other major characteristic of a region is that it focuses on the world of work. And so some of you may have your own backgrounds within such fields. And so you don't necessarily feel that you have a very strong disciplinary home. And this is going to have an effect on the kinds of studies you supervise and the kinds of research that you yourself do. Muller and Boughey both suggest that these broad conversations around the type of discipline will have implications for the ways in which you approach supervision. They argue that those who are in what I'm calling casually the hard sciences, you're going to have more social connectedness because there is agreement about what falls within your discipline and what is outside of your discipline. There is general agreement about what constitutes a suitable research problem. There is general agreement around the kinds of methods that should be followed. So teaching can be more collaborative, and what is taught tends not to be as contentious. It's possible for someone to take over and teach someone else's module, for example, if they are on leave, because there's more agreement about what should go into Mathematics 101 than perhaps what should constitute an introduction to sociology course, which would lead to a lot more conversation and debate with different people in sociology having very different views about what students should be learning. And so one of the arguments goes is that hards will have more time to devote to research because the things that they teach are more or less agreed upon. And they're not having to spend as much time selecting and developing materials. There's also an idea that research and supervision in these hard disciplines are much more integrated. So supervisors will be supervising topics that they themselves are researching, and it would be very unlikely in a hard discipline for you to have a research interest and then to be supervising in an entirely different area. That would be unlikely in the hards, and yet is very common in the softs, where a supervisor has their own research interest and they may supervise 3 or 4 different students, each of whom is researching in a different field using entirely different literature and possibly even entirely different methods. And this, some argue, means that less time is spent on supervision by the hards, whereas the softs will be spending more time because they can't just pull their students into their own research projects, and they can't as easily supervise their students collectively because each of the students are doing different things. You may or may not agree with this position, but I think it's something to think about in relation to your own disciplines. Another big factor is what Liz Harrison in her book Paperheads called the identity work of postgraduate education. as we will be talking elsewhere in this course, when students take on knowledge practices of the field, they are having to take on the identity of that field. They are having to become particular kinds of knowers. And this is an increasing body of research that looks at the impact of this on students. Some fields require far more upheaval in terms of students' identities as they become members of that discipline than other fields, where students can simply take on the knowledge, skills, and practices as an identity alongside all of their existing identities, and their new identity as a scientist, for example, may not cause much conflict with all their other existing identities. Again, a contentious issue, but certainly one worth considering. I'm going to end this presentation with this slide, which we'd like you to consider in a bit of depth and to perhaps go and do the reading, which you will find in the course by Anne Lee, in which she suggests 5 different kinds of approaches to supervision. These are functional supervision, enculturation supervision, critical thinking supervision, emancipation supervision, and relationship development supervision. So she is arguing that these 5 types, again, are not discrete, but that these are large kind of categories. And it would be interesting as I go through this table with you, for you to think about which particular kind of approach to supervision is the most natural approach to you, or the most dominant approach that you think that you take on. You may even like to give this table to your students and ask them to identify what they see as your dominant approach, if you're brave enough. In the functional approach to supervision, Anne suggests that the supervisor's main concern is with guiding students through the steps, one after the other. The focus is on the rational progression through the tasks, and she'll be directing and managing the project. And of course, the students may have all sorts of reactions to that. Possibly they'll become very organized and obedient, if you're lucky. Then she suggests the second major approach to supervision is one of enculturation. And here, the supervisor's main activity will be being the master to the student apprentice, modeling and nurturing a particular way of being, and acting as the gatekeeper of the discipline to make sure that only those students that take on that particular cultural way of being should be allowed into the discipline. And the supervisor would be very good at diagnosing deficiencies and helping students to see where their weaknesses are, and coaching them and helping them to overcome those weaknesses. The student may well follow that role modeling and take up that apprenticeship and learn to take on the practices that are so valued in that discipline, if you're lucky. The third approach to supervision that Anne Lee suggests is one of critical thinking, where the supervisor's main activity is to help students to evaluate what it is that they're reading and writing and thinking and doing. And the supervisor will challenge the student to go deeper and further. And whatever it is the student presents, the supervisor will help them to see the alternative viewpoint. The supervisor will be focused on argumentation and analysis. If you're lucky, your student will emerge being someone who has a constant inquiry and who for themselves reflexively thinks about their own practices and their own thinking. On the other hand, you might get a fight or flight reaction where the student doesn't like being constantly challenged and pushing back. The fourth dominant approach to supervision identified by Anne Lee is one of emancipation. And in this one, the supervisor mentors the student, but in a way to support the student's own construction of knowledge. So they see their role as supporting the student to make sense of the field for themselves. And they will be facilitating that process and constantly reflecting on the extent to which the student is making meaning for themselves. And if you're lucky, the student reaction will indeed be one of personal growth as they become free, as they take on their full capacity and agency to act for themselves and possibly to reframe the knowledge they encounter and themselves in terms of where they're going. And the final approach to supervision that Anne-Lee presents us with is that of relationship development. And here the supervisor's focus is very much on the interactions between herself and her students. She's supervising through the experience of that interaction. She supervises through developing the relationship, and that would be her focus. And so a lot of her energy would be spent to manage any potential conflict or power imbalances, and she would need to have good emotional intelligence to do this. Hopefully, the end result would be a student who is empowered not only in terms of the knowledge, but in terms of being a good team member and who has understanding around negotiating knowledge creation and has enhanced emotional intelligence. So which approach to supervision would you think is your dominant or sort of knee-jerk model, let's say approach to supervision? Or perhaps think of your own supervisor. Which was the dominant approach that your supervisor showed? Now, importantly, and this is probably the most important point about this table and a point that is often lost, Anne-Lee is not suggesting that any one of these is good or any one of these is bad. What she is suggesting is that a good supervisor is able to navigate between these 5 approaches. While we may all have a dominant approach, a good supervisor will be able to assess the student's needs at the time, will be able to assess the progress of the research project, and be able to adapt her approach accordingly. That is the goal. Thank you very much for joining me for this slideshow, and I hope it was useful.